Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 904 for October 20th, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
The first meeting we had with someone that I didn't already know from my days at Whiskey Advocate was with Jason Parker at Copperworks. And I just cold emailed him and said, hey, we're starting an independent bottler. You don't know me. I used to be at Whiskey Advocate. Nora, my partner, used to be at Aster Wines. We're doing this. And he wrote back and said, we've been waiting for someone to do this. Please come and talk to us.
A year ago, Nora Ganley-Roper and Adam Polonski released their first Lost Lantern whiskies in an attempt to bring the tradition of independent bottlings to American whiskey. Their initial releases from distilleries like Balcones, Iron Root Republic, Whiskey Del Bach, and Santa Fe Spirits were hits. Now, Adam and Nora have released a new set of single cask bottlings to mark their first anniversary. I'll talk with them later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Sipping and Spitting This Week department, a concussion update, Behind the Label, and...
We do live in a world of the past, the present, and the future all the time together.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
What do Japan and Scotland have in common? You guessed it, whiskey. That's why Dewar's brought these two cultures together in our newest cask series innovation, introducing Dewar's 8-year Japanese Smooth. We took the Dewar's you know and love and finished it in rare Mizunara oak casks for a complex and balanced Scotch whiskey like no other.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news, and we'll start with a big change at Johnnie Walker, where longtime master blender Dr. Jim Beveridge announced his plans today to retire at the end of this year. He's been with Diageo and its predecessor companies for 42 years and served for the last 20 as master blender. His successor will be Dr. Emma Walker, the first woman to serve as master blender for Johnnie Walker. She'll lead the team of 12 blenders who work on the various Johnnie Walker expressions. Earlier this year, she led a Zoom tasting for whiskey writers of the Jane Walker blend that she created. At the time, Johnnie Walker was celebrating Women's History Month in March, along with the First Women campaign.
The quote says you can't have a second, third, or fourth without a first. And as someone that's come up through chemistry, I think it's amazing that we're starting to talk a lot more about the history of chemistry, the women that were involved, and things are coming more to the fore because it's easier to think about yourself in a position if you can see it. So that's what we want to continue doing. I've been able to speak about the great people I work with, and I think we're all getting better about actually talking about the people that are behind the curtain in whiskey and sort of showing that there's a lot of women. It's such a mixed balance of people because everyone who works in whiskey loves it and wants to continue working and wants the best thing. So having a mix of people and different opinions, so as you were talking about having a mix of people nosing whiskey, having a mix of people making it is always the best thing.
As for Jim, you'll recall that he was awarded an OBE in 2019 by Queen Elizabeth for his services to the Scotch whiskey industry. Last year, I interviewed Jim during the 200th anniversary celebrations for Johnnie Walker.
Whiskey makers are pretty unique. We kind of live in the past because these are the whiskies that have been made for us. We live in the present, which is now, and let's enjoy where we are now and make the most of what we got. But also we've got this huge responsibility to think of the future, to make sure that the whiskies we make today, the decisions that we're making today, are the right ones for the future as well. So we do live in a world of the past, the present, and the future all the time together.
You can listen to that interview in episode 832 of WhiskyCast. It's in the archives at whiskycast.com. In other news, there is no sign of a resolution to the Heaven Hill strike, now in its second month. Heaven Hill has now declared an impasse in contract talks with plans to start hiring non-union replacement workers. The United Food and Commercial Workers Union represents 420 striking workers at Heaven Hill's main campus in Bardstown, Kentucky. It's responded by filing a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board, accusing Heaven Hill of refusing to bargain in good faith. Heaven Hill claims the union has been mischaracterizing the terms of its last, best, and final offer to both its members and the media, and has published the terms of that offer online. We have included a link in the show notes for this episode at the WhiskyCast website, along with a link to the union's website. The dispute reached a new level last Wednesday when a tanker truck overturned while leaving the Heaven Hill Bardstown facility and crashed near the striking workers' picket line. According to Heaven Hill, the truck belonged to one of Heaven Hill's regular contract carriers and was carrying a load of bourbon to the Norfolk Southern Railroad terminal in Louisville. The tank remained intact, no whiskey was spilled, and no one was hurt. Union officials are taking a different view. In a statement, they accused the truck's driver of taking his hands off the wheel to make, quote, a threatening gesture to a local 23D worker on strike, and lost control of his truck. The union is demanding the driver be fired and not allowed to return to the Bardstown facility. Let's update a story now that we first reported back in June on the U.S. government's plans to create an official definition for American single malt whiskeys. That's when the Treasury Department's Tax and Trade Bureau added those plans to the government's official regulatory agenda, along with guidance that the first draft version of the regulations could be issued in December. Steve Hawley of Seattle's Westland Distillery is also the executive director of the American Single Malt Commission. He's been in touch with TTB officials on a regular basis and gave whiskey writers an update Tuesday night during a Judgment of Westland Zoom tasting.
Every indication is that the standard of identity, or the definition that we've drafted and have been working with for 6 years now, is what will be reflected in what they publish. I get less confidence when I ask if they're going to hold to that timeline. I haven't had anybody tell me yet that it's not going to be December, but I certainly am not getting confirmation that it will be December. So as of now, that is the plan. That will trigger another public comment period. So if all goes well, we're looking at spring of next year, which is super, super. I've never been more optimistic and never felt that we're closer than we are now.
The public comment period would last for 60 days, but there is no specific time limit for the TTB to release a final regulation after that comment period ends. One of Australia's biggest distillers is getting even larger. Lark Distilling Company is buying the Shane Estate Distillery in Pontwell, Tasmania, from the Kernke family for $40 million Australian dollars. That's about $29.7 million US. The deal includes not only the distillery and all of its maturing whiskey, but the entire farm and estate. Lark plans to use that site to build a new distillery capable of producing 1 million liters of alcohol each year. To put that in perspective, the existing distillery at the farm produces 130,000 liters a year. Lark Distilling is the former Australian Whisky Holdings, which changed its name last year. It owns the Lark Distillery just outside of Hobart and the Nant Distillery in Bothwell, both in Tasmania. There are lots of new whiskeys to talk about. We'll have some of the highlights on the next episode of WhiskyCast. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. Whiskey and Barrel Night is on tap for Thursday night in Los Angeles. McTeers has its next auction of rare whiskies Friday in Glasgow, Scotland. The Spirit of Toronto's Warehouse series of virtual tastings gets underway Friday night with Japan's Chichibu Distillery, followed by Hiram Walker Distillery's Dr. Don Livermore next Friday night. Bourbon on the Banks is this weekend in Frankfort, Kentucky, along with the Whiskey X in Las Vegas. And that's where Art Begg's Monsters of Smoke tour has stops this week, along with a second tour visiting New Jersey. The Manchester Whiskey Festival is next Friday and Saturday in England, along with the Stirling Whiskey Festival in Scotland. The Indie Spirits Expo returns to Chicago November 1st. The Bourbon Classic is in Louisville, Kentucky, November 3rd through the 6th. And the Spirit of Speyside Festival is November 3rd through the 8th in Scotland. Remember, all in-person events are still subject to change on short notice, and you may have to show proof of vaccination or a recent negative COVID test in order to attend. Make sure you check ahead of time. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states and 3 continents, and online, too. Visit the all-new BuyVirginiaRye.com site for more details, and please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Oban and the Classic Malts lineup. Independent bottlers have been part of the whiskey industry for more than a century, though you are most likely to see them in Scotland, where a thriving market of casks for blending use makes it possible to snap up single casks and bottle them under your own label. While there have been a handful of independent bottlers in the U.S. over the years, it's been largely the practice for distilleries in the States to bottle their own single casks instead of selling them to potential competitors. Before the pandemic started, Nora Ganley-Roper and Adam Polonski gave up their day jobs to start Lost Lantern, their attempt to create a U.S.-based independent bottler. She worked at Aster Wines in New York City. He was a writer for Whiskey Advocate, and between them, they had a lot of connections in the craft distilling world. They spent 8 pre-pandemic months visiting distilleries and selecting casks for their first bottlings, which came out a year ago this past week. To celebrate their first anniversary, they have released a new set of 5 different whiskeys. We connected on Zoom Friday to catch up. So it's been a year since the two of you started Lost Lantern. What have you learned?
We've learned so much. I think the biggest thing is that there is an appetite out there for an American independent bottler. This model has existed in Scotland forever. It hasn't really been in the United States in this way before, and we really wanted to bring it here for American whiskey. And we've seen that people really want that. There are enough people out there who understand it or maybe weren't familiar with it, but they hear about it and they're excited about it and see it as a great way to discover new whiskeys from around the country. And that's been really, really gratifying on our first anniversary.
And that there's appetite for whiskey that we always think is going to be hard to sell. Every release we predict what's going to be the hardest one to sell. And so far, it's always been the one that sells fastest, is the one that we think is the more off the beaten path. And so that's been really wonderful to see how many people are excited about. For us, our $108 corn whiskey sold out in 20 minutes, and we did not anticipate that. So that's been really fun to watch.
What would you do differently?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we got it's weird to say this, but in some ways we got lucky with being forced to do direct to consumer. So the pandemic, we were originally supposed to launch April 2020, and we even had distribution lined up in New York and California, and then bars and stores shut down. And we were originally really going to be focused on those 2 markets. And with the pandemic, there's been this surge of e-commerce partners that allow us to be 3-tier compliant and do all the things that we need to do legally, while mirroring the online ordering process that people get for every other industry. And that setup has allowed us to ship to 40 states through retail partners and to talk to people that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to talk to, and actually really get a sense of where there's demand. Like Washington State has been an amazing place for us, and we wouldn't have been able to do that otherwise. And so in retrospect, we should have been doing this all along, but we couldn't have. But it's been the biggest surprise for us how effective this direct to consumer setup has been.
Yeah. My only regret is that until very, very recently, we were never able to taste whiskey with people in person because we've been in Vermont. It was the pandemic. It was winter. And then early in the summer, we did our first in-person tasting event with some people in Vermont. And that was really satisfying to be able to do, because I grew up in the industry going to whiskey festivals and things like that, like Whiskey Fest all over the country. And that's how I learned about whiskey. And I want to be able to tell people about what we're doing in the distilleries we're excited about that way. So I really look forward to when the pandemic is finally over, 7 or 8 years from now, and we're able to do those kind of tastings.
What's the reaction been from within the distilling community? Are there distillers that have said, we're going to sell our own stuff, we don't want to work with an independent? Or has everybody been eager to work with you?
The interesting thing is, people who make American single malt are really easy because they are familiar generally with independent bottlers in Scotland. Some of them have explicitly told us that they want there to be an independent bottler in the United States. It was actually the first meeting that we had when we spent 8 months on the road. The first meeting we had with someone that I didn't already know from my days at Whiskey Advocate was with Jason Parker at Copperworks. And I just cold emailed him and said, hey, we're starting an independent bottler. You don't know me. I used to be at Whiskey Advocate. Nora, my partner, used to be at Aster Wines. We're doing this. And he wrote back and said, we've been waiting for someone to do this. Please come and talk to us. So American single malt people are easy. Bourbon and rye people sometimes don't understand the model right away if they're not coming from the American whiskey world. And some of them get really enthusiastic about it. And that's more so over time when they see that we make it our job to go out and tell their stories and say why we are excited about these distilleries that a lot of people don't know yet. We've only had 1 or 2 places tell us to basically to buzz off and leave them alone, and they're not interested and never want to talk to us.
Yeah. But overall, I mean, the industry has been so fantastic to us, and we've gotten so much support from so many great distilleries across the country. And the more success we have, the more success they have, because we look at our job as telling the story of those distilleries and why they're so fantastic. So it really is a win-win in our minds and a lot of their minds as well.
There were some people who hesitated at first and they were like, this sounds cool. Let's see how you do with it for a little bit. And we both totally respect that. We're like, even if we know them, we're coming into the industry with a new business. I'm a journalist. Everyone wants to see how we do with it. And some people said yes right away, like Balcones, we will sell you casks. Let's do this. And other people said, come back in a little while and then we'll talk about it. And some of those people have since switched to, okay, yeah, we'll sell you some casks. Let's do this.
Right.
And I respect that because we're asking people to let us put their brand names on our label and trust us with their whiskey. I understand if there's a little hesitation at first, but then it's very gratifying when they
say
later.
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially when you're selling single casks and they could be selling that same single cask and keeping all the profit for themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the anniversary tranche of bottlings. You've got 5 of them. And there are some interesting distilleries in here that we hadn't seen represented before in your earlier releases, places like St. George Spirits out in California.
Yes. Yeah.
How was it working with Lance and the boys out there?
Well, we've always loved their whiskey. And their fantastic gins. And they for us were kind of a wish list at the very beginning when we started this project. And we honestly put them on a list that we don't have a great name for. We should come up with it. But basically of distilleries that we want to talk to, and we assume that they will never in a million years sell us casks. And then when they said yes, we were very excited because their approach to whiskey is really unique. And frankly, the range of barrels that they have in their warehouse that we got to taste, it was almost impossible to select casks. I mean, they've been around doing amazing things for so long. So it was really exciting for us. And this whiskey is really unique. It's actually in our cream label. We do different colors for the different styles of whiskey, and cream signals that it's not necessarily exactly what you expect from that style. So it's technically a single malt, but in the American tradition, it is a malt whiskey. It's a new American oak, but it was distilled. I guess it's distilled from beer, so it's depending on how you look at it, it's not technically malt whiskey, but regardless, it's the grassiest whiskey, kind of fresh creme brulee flavors that we've ever tasted. And so we were, in the end, we couldn't say no to this one, but it was very exciting for us to work with a distillery of their caliber, and just for the length of time, because a lot of the distilleries we work with are all making great whiskey, but a distillery that's as established as St. George was really exciting.
Yeah.
And then the folks at Watershed in Ohio have been doing some really interesting work and flying under the radar for a long time now among bourbon fans.
Yeah.
What was it like working with them in Columbus?
That was fun because that was a distillery that we did not know as well before we visited them. And that's one of the reasons that before the pandemic, we spent so much time traveling around the country, because like, if you're plugged into the whiskey world, you know the big names in craft distilling. But then there are a lot of places like Watershed that they're making really good whiskey, but they sell all of it in Ohio. And if you're not in Ohio, you're probably, or like in the states that border it, you probably are not going to have seen it. So we found them, we visited them, and we were both really impressed by what they're doing. And the whiskey that we have from them has a really interesting 5-grain mash bill. It has spelt in it. And I look forward to talking to them in more detail. And because I think they're not using that mash bill anymore for most of their whiskeys, but it's really great to see this level of innovation and experimentation in a climate that's relatively similar to Kentucky's. It's right across the border. But I love finding these places that are really locally beloved, but just not as well known beyond that.
And that would be the case with Cedar Ridge in Iowa. Everybody thinks Iowa whiskey, you think Templeton Rye, but Cedar Ridge has been doing a lot of good stuff. I just got a sample bottle of their single malt, and now I'm going to get to compare it against yours.
That is fun. Yeah, this is our second cask from them. Our first cask was a bourbon. It was the first bourbon that we put out, and Cedar Ridge has also been on our short list forever as an example of a distillery that we loved, but a lot of people didn't know, and that we were really excited to put their whiskey out at cask strength, because at the time when we first bought whiskey from them, they were putting everything out at 80 proof, which doesn't always speak to whiskey nerds. Now I think they're up to 86 proof, but we thought at cask strength, it was a no-brainer. So this is a single malt that was finished in a sherry butt, and for us is the most traditional single malt that we've worked with so far. I think it's going to be really exciting for people that love sherried Scotch to try this, because I mean, we didn't think of Iowa single malt before we tried this. Frankly, we didn't go to Cedar Ridge to buy single malt. And they, as it happens with us, with many distilleries, they said, you can buy what you want, but you have to taste this cask. And then when we tasted that cask, we were like, yep, we'll take a sample home, but we'll probably buy this.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
The fun thing there is that it's a family-run distillery. Jeff Quint, who's the founder, was very excited to sell us this cask. Mm-hmm. And we found out later that it was one of Murphy Quint, the head distiller, and his son. It was one of his very favorite casks in the whole place. And I've kind of gotten this vibe that he was like, Dad, why did you let them buy that? We wanted that. But
yeah.
So we were very excited to have that, and think that it's from Iowa, but this really reminds me of sherried Scotch in many ways. Obviously it's not a Scotch, it's from Iowa, but it's like the American take on that. And I'm excited for you and for other people to try that.
And keeping with that non-traditional vein, you don't expect single malts from Iowa. You don't expect rye whiskeys from California. And you have one of those from Spirit Works.
Yeah. And we're super excited about Spirit Works because they are so focused on sustainability. Their rye is organic. They are in the middle of wine country, and we think that's reflected in the whiskey they make. It's really kind of herbaceous and delicious. And personally, I always get excited by a female-owned, female-run distilling team because there are so few of them. So I'm always excited about that. But when we visited, we fell in love with a bottled and bond wheat whiskey that they made, and it was the most complex wheat whiskey we've had. And that immediately knocked our socks off. And then we knew we had to do something with them. And it ended up being rye. But we're super excited about this release as well.
And then Boulder Spirits in Colorado with a bourbon, getting back to slightly more traditional. Colorado's done a lot of stuff with good bourbons with a lot of those distillers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we think that's interesting because the founder of Boulder is from Scotland. He's a Scotsman. They have a Forsyth still, which really, I don't see that many of them across the country. I know Balcones has one. There are a couple around. They make a lot of single malt, and we think that ethos carries over to their bourbon as well. It has a really high malt mash bill. It's 51% corn, 44% malted barley. So, which is the highest mash bill or the highest malt mash bill that I've ever seen, and pretty much as high as you can get.
Right.
So it's kind of this interesting, like, it's a bourbon, of course, but it has some of these like single malt notes to it that are really interesting.
We find, depending on what order we taste in, you taste more or less of that malt characteristic, where I think it would be hard to blind as a bourbon. And it's worth noting that this is by far our highest proof at 138.5 proof. So that's not for the faint of heart, certainly.
I go through all these with you. It is something I don't normally do with an independent bottler releasing a range of whiskeys, but I wanted to go through these with you individually because this also introduces our listeners to some distilleries they may never have heard of. And I think that's one of the benefits you guys bring to the table with Lost Lantern is, as you noted earlier, not all of these distilleries get a lot of attention outside of their home markets. And you're able to get them out into the world a little bit and give them some exposure that they need. And I think that's a benefit for, as you said earlier, a win-win.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly. Even some of these distilleries are very successful already in their home market or in a few markets, but they just may not be getting out there into, like, we talk to different people than they talk to on their own. So we can get in front of different eyes. And we think that that's really what we're excited about. And part of where this idea came from in the first place is Nora was working at Aster. She was selling a lot of craft whiskey. I was reviewing them at Whiskey Advocate and seeing that there was more and more stuff that was really good, especially as distilleries started to get to the like 8 to 10 years old mark since they had opened, that the whiskey was really exciting and good right now, not just whiskey that had potential for the future. And we wanted to get out there and say, like, hey, maybe you tried this place when it first opened, maybe you've never heard of them before, but like they are worth your attention, and we'll help you get them.
Yeah, and we'll help you find them and know what's ready and what we're excited about on a annual basis or quarterly basis. Yeah.
You two have been able over the last year and a half to pick up a lot of information, a lot of insight into the American craft distilling industry through visiting all these distilleries. I was looking through the ADI newsletter this week, and I saw something disturbing that I hadn't seen in that newsletter for, well, pretty much ever before. They noted that they were getting a whole bunch of distilleries that were up for sale. And they listed 5 specific ones around the country without naming names, but in various regions of the country that were for sale for the right price. Should we be concerned about a shakeout coming among these craft distillers that you're working with and that you're talking to on a daily basis?
We were very concerned when the pandemic started, before the PPP loans started coming through and the making hand sanitizer early on, which brought in some cash, because it's a tough business. There's scale required, there's time required. That's not true for a craft brewery. You can't turn the lights on and start selling amazing whiskey a week later. You can't start selling amazing whiskey a year later or even 3 years later in most places. So it's tough. We think that most of the places that we work with tend to be pretty dialed in. They've been around for 10-ish years. Sometimes St. George has been around for 40 years. Right. So they know what they're doing. But especially smaller craft distilleries around the country are very much still finding their footing and really dependent on customer support. What we've learned is that the quality of the whiskey they make and the strength of the business are not necessarily closely correlated. You can be making really, really good whiskey and be struggling with cash flow because you're letting your whiskey age to the point where it's really, really good, but then you're not making enough money coming in.
Eventually, we hope that just like in Scotland with the IBs, that we can help some of the distilleries with that, because we think of the role that IBs played in the 90s in Scotland, buying a lot of the whiskey that they wouldn't have been able to sell otherwise. We're not nearly at that scale at this point, and won't be in the next couple of years, but it is something that we think about down the line, is being another support for the industry with the kind of ups and downs that inevitably happen in any market.
I have to ask, did anybody offer to sell you their distillery instead of just barrels?
It hasn't happened yet, but you never know. It probably will at some point.
Yeah. Could you, though, get to a model like a lot of the independents do in Scotland, where you're buying new make and having it filled in to your barrels and aging it in, say, your warehouse, or paying them to hold it for you?
Yeah, I think eventually we will do some of that. For now, there's enough mature whiskey that is at a point where we are happy with it to be able to do all of our releases based entirely off of that. That's the nice thing about having over 2,000 distilleries in the US versus what's available in Scotland, is we have a lot more whiskey available to us. I think eventually we will want to do some of that just to play with finishes and aging conditions and all of the other things that we can do, aging things in different climates, seeing what happens in Vermont, which is where we are, versus Kentucky versus Texas. There's a lot we can do there. And as we scale up, I think inevitably we'll buy whiskey that's not totally mature, but for the next at least couple of years, we don't anticipate doing all that much of that.
So when are you going to start? Well, I know you've already done it with a couple of blends, but when are you going to start blending more of this single cask whiskey together from various distilleries?
It's been logistically challenging because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So that has slowed us down a little bit. Like we've only had 2 releases this year, and we'd originally planned to have 4, and that's because it was just impossible to get glass bottles in the summer.
And the shipping was insane. Yeah.
And the shipping. So we have some casks that we've already purchased that are earmarked for particular blends that we're working on. And we also intend to do another edition of our American Vatted Malt, which, unlike most of the blends that we'll do, is actually collaborative. For that, our first edition of that, it's a blend of single malts, and we got 6 distilleries in a room together, the distillers and blenders, and we actually made it together over the course of a quite long day that left us all with strong headaches afterwards. But we look forward to doing that again with a slightly different mix of distilleries every time.
But it's not safe yet. But yeah, we are working. We have 2 other blends that are in the works now, and part of the fun of being early is we don't have a huge warehouse of casks to work with. We're actually buying casks and thinking that they'll work well together. And then we realize we need a cask that adds this flavor, and then we have to go out and find it right now. So it is a more iterative, slower process than other, certainly Scottish IBs, but generally distilleries who are blending within their own stock.
Let me wrap up and just asking about you two, because I know the joy and stress that comes with a family-run business. Believe me, I know that joy and that stress after 16 years almost. How has it been for the two of you working together essentially nonstop? Because once you're done with Lost Lantern stuff, then you've got to do all the other fun stuff that a couple has to do.
Right.
Exactly. It's both really exciting and then sometimes really challenging and tough. Like there are days like when we're launching Whiskies, like today when we're talking to you, when it feels amazing. It's just wonderful to be talking to people, looking at everything, like people getting excited about what we're doing. And then there are days when it's a grind and it's tough. And
it's hard to leave work at work when we're working together all the time, and we are still learning to not talk about our next blend over the dinner table. So it's a blessing and a curse, I think.
I take comfort in that this is an industry that is filled with family businesses, yes. Some of which have been open for 10 years, some of which have been open for 200 years and been in the same family. And there are many mentors that we can look to and talk to about how they've done it or see that. It's an industry that really benefits from that continuity and tradition, and we're glad to be a part of that.
Nora, do you miss the retail side of things at Aster?
Definitely not this time of year. This was always when things would be absolutely crazy. I mean, I loved talking to people about wine and whiskey and being able to taste all the new things, but the craziness of the holidays, I do not miss that for a minute.
Adam, do you miss journalism? Or are you still committing it occasionally?
I think some of what I write for our blog kind of falls into the journalism vein. I feel like what I liked about journalism was always being able to tell the stories of places that I was excited about, and that's what we still get to do. What I miss is tasting Scotch more, because we're in Vermont. There's not all that much of it available, and I miss being able to write about that and talk to Scotch people. We're going to get on a plane to Scotland and Ireland probably as soon as it's safe, just for a nice whiskey vacation. But
not a vacation from whiskey, but a vacation to taste whiskey that we're not buying and bottling. So yet.
There is a difference between drinking professionally and professionally drinking, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I hate to say it, at least from your perspective, but their St. George bottling from this week's release sold out over the weekend. There is a link to the Lost Lantern website in the show notes for this episode at WhiskyCast.com. And that's WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Oban. Every sip of Oban is like a postcard from Scotland. Whether it's the classic Oban 14-year-old, the 18-year-old, Oban Little Bay, or the Distillers edition, every drop comes from the coastal town of Oban and a distillery just 206 steps away from the sea. It's one of Scotland's smallest distilleries, with just 7 people who make whiskey the same way their predecessors have since 1794. Find out more at obanwhiskey.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department, or should I say the What I'm Sipping and Spitting This Week department, is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. My tasting is still restricted right now because of that damned concussion, but I have been able to do a little bit of tasting in the last couple of days. Let's start off with one of the Lost Lantern releases, a 5-year-old rye whiskey from California's Spirit Works Distillery. It's distilled from a mash of 70% organic rye, 10% malted rye, and 20% malted barley, bottled at 61% ABV. The nose has touches of baking spices, honey, red apples, and hints of molasses and brown sugar. The taste has a tart lemon pepper spiciness, along with notes of cocoa powder, brown sugar, honey, and vanilla. Adding some water opens up touches of fruity character, while not diminishing the spicy intensity. The finish has gently lingering spices and a lemony tartness, with hints of cocoa and vanilla in the background. I'm scoring the Lost Lantern Spirit Works Single Cask Rye a 92. Seattle's Westland Distillery has released its 6th edition of its Garyana American Single Malt. This year's edition mixes virgin Gary Oak casks from the Pacific Northwest with a combination of Pedro Jimenez, Calvados, and brandy casks, all matured for 41 months. It's bottled at 50% ABV. The nose has a nice maltiness with hints of pine and cedar, fresh peaches, and dried fruits. The taste has a touch of pine sap and pine needles, cedar shavings, gentle spices, and dried fruits with a very nice balance. The finish is long and spicy with just a hint of pine. I'm scoring Westland's Garyana Edition 6 a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. They're reviving the tradition of Maryland-style rye at their Baltimore Farm and Waterfront Distillery. In-person tastings are available once again at the distillery in Baltimore, but you'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. They are offering WhiskyCast listeners a free virtual guided tasting. When you buy a bottle at your local retailer, a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through it. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com and use the code WhiskyCast, all one word, to access. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap up now with a very special whiskey. Earlier this year, longtime Glen Grant veteran Dennis Malcolm joined us on the eve of his 60th anniversary in the industry, with almost all of that time spent at Glen Grant. The distillery has now released a 60-year-old single cask in his honor. The Dennis Malcolm 60th Anniversary, 60 years old, comes from an ex-sherry cask that he selected. It's bottled at 52.8% ABV, and the nose has touches of toffee, a gentle kiss of smoke from the coal fires that heated the stills back then, orange marmalade, nutty hints of pecans and walnuts, along with apricots and peaches. The taste is fruity and vibrant with Christmas cake, raisins, marzipan, orange peel, dark chocolate, toffee, and dried fruits. The finish is long and dark with touches of dark chocolate, Christmas cake, and just a hint of smoke. It's an outstanding whiskey with no signs of oakiness at all, and just like the man it's named for, it has aged very well. I'm scoring the Glen Grant Dennis Malcolm 60th Anniversary 60 years old single malt a 97. We'll hear from Dennis himself in just a few minutes. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,200 different whiskeys at WhiskyCast.com.
It's been 175 years and Dewar's continues to stay curious. We're proud to announce the newest addition to the innovative Dewar's 8-year cask-finished series of Scotch whiskey, Dewar's Japanese Smooth. Brought to life by our award-winning master blender, Stephanie McLeod, Japanese Smooth is a perfectly balanced 8-year-old Scotch whiskey that puts a pioneering and innovative focus on our aging process. After 8 years in Scotland, we blend, age again, then finish this whiskey in casks made from 200-year-old Mizunara oak trees. Rare, sure, but worth it. The Mizunara oak perfectly complements the tasty notes with Dewar's Scotch whiskey. Japanese Smooth is loaded with Dewar's signature honey and floral notes, with the Japanese Mizunara oak adding exotic sweet and spicy flavors. Curious? Try this one in a perfect Japanese highball or on the rocks.
Let's open the inbox now for your voice. Last time around, I shared some of your nominations for the mythical Nobel Prize in Whiskey. Juan Cruz emailed his list of nominations, along with justifications for each nominee, so I thought I'd share his email with you. Here's what he had to say. Mark, hope this email finds you well and on the way to full recovery from your accident. This week's question is interesting and hard, especially in the absence of criteria. It was fun to think about it, though. As far as I know, there are 6 Nobel categories: medicine, literature, physics, chemistry, economics, and peace. For the purposes of this email, replace medicine with innovation and literature with industry stewardship. So, my nominees are Whiskey Innovation, Stephanie McLeod, Master Blender Extraordinaire at Dewar's. Whiskey Stewardship, Fawn Weaver for her stewardship on diversity and history preservation. Whiskey Physics, Dr. Jim Swan and David Pickerel, both posthumously shared, for their contributions to the craft. In my humble opinion, without them, whiskey would not be what it is today. Whiskey Chemistry, Dr. Bill Lumsden unanimously, enough said. Whiskey Economics, Dewar's or Four Roses, for the quality-to-value ratio of their whiskeys. And Whiskey Peace, Jim McEwen or Richard Patterson, for their worldwide contributions, influence, increasing enthusiasm for whiskey, and their passion. At any rate, I would hate to be a member of any prospective panel making a whiskey Nobel decision. A hard task. Have a great day. Take care, Juan. Juan, that is a very well thought out list, and while I didn't allow it last week, I will allow the posthumous nominations for Jim and Dave this time. Thanks, Juan, for sharing it with us. Longtime listener Dave Kuhn sent this dispatch from his trip to Iowa last week, where he met up with Jim McEwen at Brook Laddie. Here's what he said. So, Thursday was a good day. I bought a bottle of Final Act of Creation, McEwen's own Princess Diana cask, I'm sure you know the very special bottling, as part of the 2020 Laddie Fage charity auction for a pretty hefty amount, and because of the tariff, I had them hold on to it until I could come and get it. I finally did this week. I asked Lynn McEwen if Jim might pop over and sign the bottle. He got all dressed up. She told me about his favorite Swiss cigars that he has to order directly from a shop in Switzerland, and that if I brought him some, he'd be super excited. He was. What an absolute legend and great man. So lovely and nice. Dave also shared a couple of photos of he, Jim, the cigars, and, of course, the bottle. Thanks, Dave. And if there is something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers from around the world, you can always find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. One of the benefits of being the Prince of Wales, or the Duke of Rothesay, as Prince Charles is known in Scotland, is that one must never wait in line for a distillery tour. The Prince visited Glengarry Distillery in the Scottish Highlands on October 5th to see the restoration project that is underway now. We discussed that project and the environmental impacts with Glengarry manager Quanili Midluli and Beam Suntory's Alistair Longwell back in May during episode 872. By all accounts, the royal visit went well. He toured the distillery, tasted whiskey from a 1978 cask, and signed a different cask that will eventually be bottled for charity. But not all of those royal visits go according to plan. During his conversation with whiskey writers the other day about his new 60th anniversary bottling, Glen Grant's Dennis Malcolm talked about the Prince's visit to Glen Grant back in 2013.
You know, you could learn a lot from Prince Charles because he was a very skilled people's person, you know. When he wanted to walk around the distillery with us, he didn't want me to tell him what they were doing. He just says, just give me the name. That's all I gave him. And then he asked all the questions. Married, single, live in Rothers, been in Israel for how long? What did they do here? You know, he was excellent at making him speak. And while we were chatting away, this almighty thunderous crash. The depalletizer pushed a whole pallet of empty bottles off the side and onto the floor. And he said to me, wow, that'll be costly. And do you know something? The people who were his detectives couldn't help but show themselves. They just darted around him, you know. They couldn't try to protect him. They wondered what it was. We didn't know they were there either, you know. And then the crash came and all these people started bustling round about us, pushing me out the way. But it was quite good. It was a lovely, enjoyable day.
As I mentioned earlier, Dennis joined us on the Happy Hour live webcast for the entire hour back in April on the eve of his 60th anniversary. You can watch the on-demand video replay at the WhiskyCast YouTube channel. If you have something you'd like to see us look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot. The tears of Ireland's great writers bursting with flavour, humour and angst. Bottled for you to taste. No writers were harmed in the making of this premium Irish whiskey. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of our past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
You know, people always ask me, does Redbreast go better with ice or without? Would it go well with figs, dark chocolate, apple crumble? Is there one particular thing I should enjoy it with? I tell them, yeah, other people.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Just like the end of this WhiskyCast episode, Dewar's Scotch whiskey always makes for a smooth finish. Like our newly released Dewar's Japanese Smooth, aged for 8 years in Scotland, blended then aged again before being finished for up to 6 months in Mizunara oak casks made from 200-year-old Japanese water oak trees. These unique casks layer distinct dry and spicy flavors to the whiskey, with aromas reminiscent of sandalwood and incense. Keep an eye out for a bottle of Dewar's Japanese Smooth at a store near you.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.